right, we are live with another edition of the Osceola Seminole Sidelines. It's been a big month for Florida State football in terms of recruiting, and to talk about what's going on not only throughout the month of July, but particularly yesterday and today, I am joined by Osceola recruiting analyst, the legend Charles Fishbein, and a man people around college football recruiting know well, Rivals Southeast recruiting analyst John Garcia. Welcome, guys.
What's up?
Good to be here.
It's a lot going on. We are sitting here right now waiting for Tye Hylton to go live on Instagram to talk about where he will be committing. It is down between Florida State, Florida, Miami, UCF, and Penn State. We'll talk a little bit about that after he commits. But guys, the news yesterday was probably the biggest firework that has gone off for Florida State in the month of July. Jonathan Daniels, the four-star offensive tackle from Pensacola Pine Forest High School. We had heard he may commit anytime in July, as early as July 4th, as late as tomorrow, but he committed yesterday. Fish, this is a guy that you have predicted would be a Florida State commit virtually from the get-go, and it came to fruition. So I want to get both of your takes on what the commitment of Jonathan Daniels over to Florida State over Georgia, LSU, and Kentucky means. And Fish, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I've told you all along. I've always felt that area for Florida State, they've kind of not recruited hard, and since Norvell's gotten over to Florida State, they put bigger emphasis on landing kids out of Pensacola and west of Tallahassee. And I think Jonathan Daniels is one of the top linemen in the state. He's a little undersized. We've talked about it. We've seen it anywhere from 6'3" to 6'5". I think he's in that 6'3.5" range. So he's not your typical tackle, but he reminds me a lot of Isaiah Wynn, who came out of Lakewood High School, played at Georgia. He's a long kid, but he's versatile enough to move into guard or center at the next level. You like that versatility, but he's also athletic enough to handle a speed rush off the edge. So he gives you all the components of a tackle, but the versatility is there of him playing inside as well.
Yeah, and obviously, John, you and I were texting back and forth about this yesterday. When was he going to commit? We both heard different things. From a more national perspective, how big was it for Florida State to land Daniels, particularly after they thought they were in the lead for Jason Zandamela and Manasseh Atiti, and both of those kids commit to USC. And then you had Derek Plaz, who some would argue that Florida State was kind of playing out the hand with Derek, and he ends up at Miami. Just talk about how important it was for Florida State to land that commitment based on what had happened with those other three guys who were definitively on FSU's board and fairly high up their board.
Yeah, we thought Daniels could maybe become the final piece to the O-line puzzle, but he ends up being the first piece for this position group. And it's a heck of a start. I mean, look, you mentioned a couple of guys that were kind of up and down with Florida State, and that happens in recruiting, and it's going to happen more in this day and age of NIL and changes of heart. But if you're starting off with maybe the most athletic offensive lineman in the state of Florida, I think that's a hell of a starting point. I think, as Fish said, Daniels can move up and down the offensive line. I mean, watch his defensive line tape. I love his defensive tape that he's put out over the last couple of seasons, dating back to his freshman year when they went to the state title game. There's a lot of flashes there defensively for Daniels. So the foundation of athleticism and power in his game is there. It's just a matter of, like Fish said, fine-tuning it relative to the scheme and what position Florida State is going to need him at. But because of that frame and athleticism and length, most importantly, everybody wanted this kid. You mentioned Georgia, LSU, Kentucky, Florida at one point looked like a major player. Miami was trying to get involved. But Jonathan is he's kind of his own kid, reserved, didn't take a ton of visits, got to a couple campuses he really needed to vet a little bit more. But Florida State was always that program for him. And I think, as Fish said, it's really critical for FSU to I would say patrol the Panhandle, not necessarily lock it down. There's so much talent, talent pools that FSU needs to dig into in the rest of the state of Florida, in South Georgia, as we've seen them do in this cycle. But you got to be sort of the gatekeeper of the Panhandle, and the blue chippers, the no doubters, in the Panhandle, you've got to lock in. And I think that alone is a good sign for Daniels, in addition to whatever his ceiling positionally is going to be.
Yeah, and how big a relief do you think it is for Mike Norvell and Alex Atkins to get that first commitment on the O-line, particularly a guy that is so highly rated? And to both you and Fish, and by the way, Tye Hylton he's just started his live. He has not announced anything yet. We will break to that shortly. But back to Daniels, we've talked a lot about it. There's been multiple reports. He's 6'3", 6'5". At the end of the day, it's probably not about height. It's probably about arm length. Does he have the arm length to be a offensive tackle at the major college level?
I think so. I saw him in person at the Under Armour event, I believe in Orlando earlier this year. And yeah, his torso, his torso is a little sawed off, but his arms are past his knees. So you see the length that everybody covets on the offensive and defensive line. And look, and I think in this day and age, it's more about that combination of length and athleticism. And really, those are the two strongest boxes that Jonathan Daniels checks in his athletic profile. So I do think if he has to play tackle, he could, but it could just depend on what the rest of this O-line group looks like for Atkins in this class of 24, and how obviously the current roster plays out. So I think he could do it, but you don't want to make him do it if he doesn't have to.
Yeah. Fish, what about you? I've got Hilton on one screen and you guys on the other, so I'm trying to watch both of you. Pay attention to both. But
hey, I'm used to playing the second fiddle to everybody else. It's all cool if you jump over there. But listen, I've said this before. The one thing is you've got to feel for Coach Norvell and his staff, and I think they've done a great job. I'm huge on roster management, and we've discussed this over and over, is making sure when you start when you're recruiting guys and you start out for this 2024 class, I believe you get a quarterback, a running back, all the way down to DB corners, is you put a number one next to each of those positions and then put a +2 or a +1 or a +3. Florida State's done a very good job with Norvell of landing guys at each position. And if I've said this with any coaching staff, if you're able to land those guys, and then if you find somebody and out recruit them, that's fine. But landing no one and then having to take a plan C later because you didn't have a plan B, that's where you get in trouble as a program. He's done a very good job. Daniels gives you that first one. We know that they have a shot at Hylton here. They probably have 2 after today. So they've put themselves in good positions now to go for Wales.
Well, and you're right. Tye Hylton has just announced that he is committed to Florida State. So now we have 2 big offensive line commitments for Florida State. And listen, Hylton's a guy I really like. I think that he is a guy that the way the institution of the transfer portal at the time it came into play allowed him another year to develop. And I think this is a guy that would get passed over 3 years ago because he was a late bloomer because of the portal, and people can wait longer to fill these needs. I think Hylton fell into Florida State's lap and the other schools that were recruiting him. But I really love this guy's tape. I think he is just looking at him on the hoof. I think he might be a half-inch taller than Jonathan Daniels.
He's taller, yeah.
But it's certainly a guy that has continued to develop. If you watch his tape, you see the athleticism. You see that he's got the ability to get bigger. That frame could hold a lot more weight. But Fish, talked with you about Tye Hylton. One of the things I like about him is he's not passive in pass protection. He's not one. If a guy puts his hands up, Tye Hylton is a very physical guy. Most people think pass blocking is a passive exercise. It is not. And when you watch Tye Hylton, he does have that little bit of a mean streak. He finishes blocks, but 2 big commitments for Florida State. Fish, I'll let you start with Tye. Then John, I'll let you talk a little bit about Tye.
I don't know what John looks like for an offensive lineman because we haven't spoke a whole bunch about O-line. I'm totally different. I don't really look at star rankings, especially up front. I believe you take numbers. 2, what I like about offensive linemen, 1, can they bend? He can bend. Is he athletic? Yes. Can he play multiple positions? Does he have that mean streak? But main thing is a kid coachable? Because a lot of these guys in high school, the biggest issue they have is mainly technique and just getting in a weight room and becoming bigger and stronger. And that's where the projections are missed so much, is that coachable side. We've seen so many guys that have the talent and they just haven't made it because they don't want to put in the work. If this kid's willing to put in the work, the physical talent's there for him to be very good. I'm watching some of his clips now, and you see him 10, 15 yards down the field. He's athletic. He can be used as a pulling guard. You could get him out space. He can get onto a linebacker or DB. So all the tools that you want in an offensive lineman this kid has, now it just comes down to how coachable is he and how willing and how hard he'll work in the weight room and on the football field.
John?
Yeah, a lot of modern traits here that you like. First of all, we just talked about it with Daniels, position versatility. Hylton has already started at both right tackle and left tackle at a high classification there at Oviedo. So he's already got sort of that ambidextrous experience, which, as you guys know, for an offensive lineman is a really big deal. It's a really big deal moving from one side to the other. He's already proven he can do that. But yeah, I'm fascinated by his motor. I think his movement skills are really strong. He seems really efficient relative to getting towards his assignment. And I was really encouraged by his ability in space, whether he was moving laterally on a slip screen or getting to the second level. It looked really easy for Hylton. So I think with both him and Daniels, you're getting sort of a type in this class for FSU and Alex Atkins, guys who are leaner, longer, who can move and maybe move around positionally all the same. And I think when you're talking about roster management and building a contender and maintaining that contender, you got to have guys who can move around. You got to have glue guys who can give you a lift in a pinch, even if it's at a different position. So guys with experience like this, whether it's O-line, D-line, or in Hylton's case, left tackle, right tackle, it gives you that much more positional flexibility as you allow them to put their weight on at the collegiate level, which all these kids are going to do when they get to Tallahassee for good. So I like the body type and the mold of these lengthy, undersized guys.
Yeah, and you talk about versatility. Obviously, that is something that's Mike Norvell holds in high regard. You see it just about, we're going to talk about Kevin Levy later. We're going to talk about KJ Bolden. They've signed BJ Gibson, who can play on both sides of the ball. We know they've talked to Tye Hylton about playing center, so they obviously feel like he can play any one of 5 positions, because obviously your left tackle and your center, your 2 most athletic guys on your offensive line. And, so obviously they feel like he's got the athleticism and the quickness to be a guy that can, if you can play center, you're usually starting off one-handed, right, when you're blocking. So it takes a special talent to play there. So now, Fish, I'll start with you on this next question. Obviously, we are all big fans of Tye Hylton. You got 2 offensive line commitments out of high school. I think we're all in agreement that the way offensive and defensive linemen are going to be recruited has changed with the advent of the transfer portal. I think you're going to see, particularly if you're not a Georgia or Alabama, you're probably going to see a little bit more 50-50 split between high school recruits and portal guys. Fish, you're kind of more in tune with where Florida State is on a individual basis. What is the plan for Florida State going forward? Do you think they'll take another high school offensive lineman, or do you think they'll go?
Well, I think, Pat, we've seen their roster. Listen, they're heavy inside. I don't think guard or center is an issue moving forward. And it's like with most schools, they need tackles. They need tackles with length and a little height. I think that this puts them in position now that they can go after some whales. I've told you before, I always like to work in recruiting with a position of strength. Norvell's done that. He did it at wide receiver. They took a lot of guys, and look who they're going after at wide receiver. They're going after the guys that everybody else wants, the Jeremiah Smiths, the Josiah Traders, the Cam Camerons. It gives them the ability now to be picky. They got 2 guys that can play. They don't need any more interior guys. Now, if there's somebody, maybe not even on the radar right now, somebody that's a big-time offensive tackle that's out there that they can call and get interest in, you never know. They have a great season. They may have to pull a tackle now that maybe they didn't have a chance at 2 or 3 months ago. So I think they put themselves in a great position to land somebody, a whale, like we like to call in this business, those guys that are the difference makers. This allows them now to be picky. They could focus on one guy, not 2 or 3, because we know this was going to be a relatively small O-line class after the last couple of years. This is going to be a small O-line class. They now can be selective at where they want to go on the offensive line.
Well, and you're right, Fish. Obviously we've seen what winning 10 games this past season has done for their recruiting. And John, my question to you is, from when Mike Norvell got here 3 years ago, I'm going on his 4th football season. They've really changed the the caliber of player they're recruiting. Just talk a little bit about what you've seen and the being able to go in and get on some of these high-profile kids. And we're going to get in on some specific high-profile kids here in a second. But just talk about the change you've seen over the last, let's say, 2 years. I mean, Fish, both you and I were at elite camp. The elite camp this year was much more talented than it was the year before. So, John, just talk a little bit about that.
I think perception moves prospects. You know, when you talk about all 3 of the big 3 changing coaching staffs multiple times in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, whichever one was going to stabilize first was going to be at a true advantage from a perceptional standpoint. And obviously Florida State on the field has become that program. And that news travels very fast, and it enables you to go out and have more success in Miami and to go grab a Hakeem Williams last cycle, right? You can go into these regions and these areas where, you know, previously it was always going to be uphill, and not only compete, but you can contend and win with these big time recruiting battles. So I do think that perception has moved so positively towards Florida State that it's really singular right now relative to Florida and relative to the Miami Hurricanes. Now, those other 2 are still recruiting very well, but it's very much a different message relative to Florida State. In fact, James Madison told me before he committed to Missouri over Florida State, he said, I kind of want to go start something. He said FSU kind of already has everything figured out. They got their guys. They're living up to what they were selling on the trail a couple of years ago, and he didn't view that as a negative towards Florida State. He just viewed that as something that he didn't want to do. You know, he didn't want to join the power. He wanted to go create it, if that makes sense. So I think that was really telling, you know, for a kid from Fort Lauderdale to talk about FSU as the established program in the state and saying, like, they're good with or without me, basically, I thought was really telling. And all 3 schools were kind of fighting to get to this point of the process. And right now, Florida State clearly holds that perceptionally, and I think when we get to the fall, that's only going to be enhanced in 2023.
Yeah, and there's a yin and yang to everything, right? James Madison's question probably at the end of the day was, look at that roster. How many balls are going to come my way?
No doubt.
Because those guys do think about that. There's no doubt about that. Well, listen, there's no doubt that this weekend is just starting. John, you mentioned in a text yesterday, I don't think you've ever seen a July like this, and I can't recall that I have either. It used to be a camp month. Now there's no camps in July. You can have one the last week if you wanted, but anyway, when you start official visits. But yeah, so it's changed. Now we know at least 3 guys are going to announce tomorrow that Florida State is involved with, and running back Micaiah Danzy from Florida High and his teammate Ashton Hampton, a safety corner, wide receiver. He's got really impressive film. And then cornerback Kevin Levy from down in South Florida, all expected to announce their commitments on Saturday at some point. We don't have times on all of them yet. Obviously, we are ready to go when they do commit, if they commit to Florida State. And I listed Danzy first on our graphic there, guys, because I think he is a lock for Florida State. He was supposed to go to official visits to both Miami and Florida in June, decided not to take those. As Fish says all the time, don't tell me what you say, show me what you do in recruiting. And I think that Danzy is a lock for Florida State. I'm going to put in my future cast later today so that I can go 2 for 2 because I put Hylton in last night. Although I don't think it should count. You can put him in 24 hours ahead of time. But anyway,
somebody else does that. And
I know.
A lot of credit.
You and I were talking about that.
It ain't you, John. Don't worry.
I know. Trust.
I'm taking the guy to Vegas because he's so good at doing this, and I need to win some money.
All right, so we're getting some viewer questions. I'm going to ask you guys about here in a second, but I want to ask you, do you guys think Danzy is a lock for Florida State? And he reminds me a little bit of Lawrence Toafili in the way he's built, the way he plays. He's even though he's got speed, but he's really a one-cut north-south guy, which as the more I go back and watch him, it kind of surprised me. But he's got the ability to catch the ball out of the backfield. He's good in the screen game there at Florida High, but more of a one-cut, get-upfield guy. And just talk a little bit about whether you think Florida State's going to get him. I think there's no doubt about that, but I'll let you guys, and then what you like about it. Fish, you want to start?
Yeah, I've been real high on Danzy since I saw him last year in the state title game. I always like to see guys live because that really gives you a perspective, especially I remember Urban Meyer. I talked to a coach. He said that Urban Meyer really put an emphasis on guys that played well in playoffs and state championships. That was very important in recruiting guys, that they took their teams far in the playoffs. And when they did get there, they were a big reason why. He was the best player on the field when I saw him last year in the state championship game. He's electric with the ball in his hands. I think he's got more speed than Toafili. I definitely agree. He's basically that versatile player that could play slot receiver, come around on jet sweeps. He also could line up in the backfield. But his ability to get into the open field and not be able to get caught, Florida State needs more playmakers like that. They've got a lot of good guys, but at wide receiver and running back, last year and the year before, they've created the most big plays, which is crazy in college football, but they really haven't had that difference maker. I think Danzy fits that mold, and that's what's exciting is that Norvell's already proven he could create the big plays with guys that can't really create them on his own. He schemed them guys into big plays. This guy, you don't have to scheme. You just run a play, and he has a chance to take it the distance anytime at any place, anywhere on the field.
Yeah, the thing that stuck out to me, and John will let you talk a little bit about Danzy, but the thing that caught my attention is his speed is effortless. Like, he gets the full speed fast, but it doesn't look he's running that fast, yet he runs away from everybody.
Yeah, there's no doubt. He's got real juice, 10-6 in the 100-meter dash, and he gets to that top speed very quickly, and he maintains it with that very track sort of disciplined stride, which really does remind you a little bit of Toafili, but I think there's a little bit more torque with what Danzy can put out there with the ball in his hands. And I think this is a great fit, if and when he picks Florida State, because Mike Norvell loves these, gadget players used to be kind of like a negative, a derogatory term, but in this day and age, in the space and spread them out game, yep, I think it's a plus. You think of a Tony Pollard, who's now going to be, running back one for the Dallas Cowboys. People had a hard time listing him at a position. Is he a receiver? Is he a returner? Is he a running back? I think Danzy has a lot of those same traits, and there's no nonsense in his game when he does have the ball in his hands. A lot of these track guys, they rely on that speed, so they don't always just hit it right when they get the football, but Danzy does. So I think it tells you a lot about his mentality. That decisiveness will absolutely translate, and he's a big kid. He's over 6 foot with the ball in his hands already. Just not your typical blend gadget guy that you would bring in. So I just think that combination of production, height, and really that true speed that he can get to in a hurry is going to command some attention once he gets to Tallahassee for good, or once he stays in Tallahassee.
Yeah, he is staying in Tallahassee, but one of his teammates may not be. And we're going to go straight to cornerback safety Ashton Hampton, and again another really good football player. He's a two-way guy, plays wide receiver. If you watch his highlight tape, you see more of his highlights at wide receiver. You can certainly see why they like him on defense. I like him better as a free safety prospect than I do a corner, although I think most people recruit him as a corner. But Fish, you put in your notes this morning that you feel like he's a Clemson guy all the way, and I tend to agree with you. Just do you guys expect that Ashton will end up somewhere other than Florida State, I guess is the main question here.
Yeah, I thought it would be either Florida State or I either thought it would be Clemson or Arkansas. I think one of the former FSU coaches is now at Arkansas, the DB
Marcus Woodson. Yep.
Once Florida State fired his dad, I've never seen a guy get fired as a coach and then his son years later follow that program. So I always was skeptical about Florida State really being an option. Clemson does very well with these type of kids. I thought he was a good fit for their program as well as Arkansas with the relationships there. It's no surprise that he's choosing Clemson today, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you got any, John? Do you have any differing thoughts on Hampton, or do you believe he's a Clemson guy all the way?
Yeah, just from a relationship standpoint, he's got some real critical ties to that Clemson staff, and obviously that was at one point the advantage for Florida State beyond the geographical ties. So yeah, I think it's kind of been Clemson's game here at the 11th hour. I think when Clemson grabs a kid on an official visit, it goes one of two ways. They love it, they buy in, and it's just kind of their fit, or it's absolutely not their kind of fit. And I think with Hampton, he's saying all those things that leads us to believe that he's going to be a Clemson Tiger. And it'll be fascinating because when it's a Tallahassee kid and it's a Florida High kid, it becomes polarizing. I think back to like a Ronnie Harrison type of player.
Yeah.
Those matter, and we look back at those from a recruiting standpoint. So it'll be fascinating to see if and when he picks Clemson and starts out that way. Just how his career develops, because he's a big time player, as you guys have mentioned, two-way guy in the secondary alone. I think he can move around quite a bit. So curious to see what his on-field fit is, especially at a place like Clemson, where he's going to, theoretically line up against Florida State one day.
Yeah, going back to Ronnie Harrison, I still cannot believe how slow Florida State played that recruitment. And of course, once Alabama offered, it was over. But that's the way he's playing for the Cleveland Browns now. The last time I heard, so that's out of the gate. All right, so another guy that we know is going to commit tomorrow, or is scheduled to commit, is cornerback wide receiver Kevin Levy. Fish, you and I have gone back, and we think this is a numbers game, right? Florida State's got a lot of potential prospects at defensive back. I think Levy is a corner all the way. I don't think he's a safety. I could be wrong about that, but I think if it was up to Kevin Levy, he would crawl to Tallahassee to play at Florida State. But what are your thoughts on there? I know Illinois is involved, among others.
Yeah, I thought once Ricky Knight committed, that basically eliminated Levy. Like I said, Florida State recruits above the guys that they've landed. Like if Ricky Knight's the floor, I don't think this kid Levy's as good. So basically, they probably feel the same way, that they got a guy in Ricky Knight and he's a very good player, but they want to recruit above that with Charles Lester down the road, most likely going to choose FSU. I just think they've put themselves in position to choose who they want instead of kids choosing Florida State. Florida State's in a position of strength. We talk about this all the time, and I hate to keep emphasizing this, but they've put themselves in position to go after a Lester, to go after a Patterson, a Chaminade, that they can pick and choose who they want now with the guys that have already committed.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about who's next. And we know that there's at least 3 prospects who have announced commitment dates. Charles Lester on July 28th, and then KJ Bolden and Jalewis Solomon, both on August 5th. I think we all agree that Lester is a hard Florida State lane at this point. I think I would be shocked. Of course, in the world of college football recruiting, nothing would shock me, but I do think that would be one of the bigger surprises if he had said as early as March, when he was here for spring practice in March and April, that essentially at heart he was already committed to Florida State. Obviously, he really enjoyed his official visit. I do think he's a kid that is he's number one. He's got a dynamic personality in addition to being a dynamic football player. But he seems to be a kid that's really enjoyed the recruiting process, good natured about it, has fun with it. Do you guys think that he is a Florida State lock right now?
I do. I mean, I think Lester, his recruitment kind of reminds me of LaMarcus Joyner. I've brought this up. Lester's been a huge FSU fan his whole life. It's hard for those type of kids. And some kids will say in passing, yeah, I liked Florida State. He really has proven. He had a visit set up to Ohio State. He didn't want to go on it. He canceled it. I think the same thing with Georgia. He's been Florida State all along. And I just don't see him picking any other school. And that's why I think you've seen like a Levy drop off. Florida State knows where these guys are kind of leaning. This puts them, once Lester pulls a trigger, I think it puts them in a position where basically they're either done or they're only going after guys just as good or better.
All right. Well, let's talk about the next guy on my list, KJ Bolden, set to announce on August 5th. For the longest time, it was thought to be a battle strictly between Georgia and Ohio State. Fish, I know that you have said as recently as yesterday on the Osceola Premium message board that you feel like Florida State is really in the thick of it with KJ and has made a significant push over the last couple of months. I want to get both your takes on where Florida State stands with KJ Bolden and where he stands with the other schools that are recruiting. John, I'll let you start. Go ahead, Fish.
No, all right. I mean, I think John will agree. Listen, I've said all the time we talked about this, what they do and not what they say. This kid continues to be on FSU's campus. Every time I look, they're not in his top 5, but he keeps visiting. He's going to visit again, and then he's taking an official visit later. I don't know if FSU will land him, but I do think they're in it more than he says they're in it by the schools that he said were in it. I think he put out a top 5 not that long ago, and Florida State wasn't in it. But like I said, he ends up on their campus over and over. Maybe there's a nice lady he likes at Florida State that he keeps coming back to visit, but there's something there that keeps drawing him back to Florida State.
Yeah, and thanks both of you for answering William's question. I forgot to put that up there while we were talking. All right, so the other guy that
he wanted to talk about Bolden, so I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
John will probably know more about him than I would since he covers that area.
Well, look, we ranked the contenders for KJ about a month out from his decision. So early July, he's committing August 5th. And look, Georgia, Ohio State was 1-2. I think that's been clear for some time. But really the fun begins after that point. A lot of people, for the bulk of his recruitment, just assumed Alabama. They recruited Buford High so very well. He's a secondary guy. I think, Nick still gets that caveat and expectation, benefit of the doubt, whatever we want to call it. But really, it's Florida State and Auburn that are the sneaky contenders for KJ because, like Fish said, he didn't use the official visit to either of those two schools, and he continues to schedule unofficial visits to both of those schools. So if his recruitment for some reason goes beyond August 5th, that's where a Florida State and or an Auburn can continue to rise up those ranks. Georgia, he's most familiar. We know about what's happened there and how tough it is to go in there and grab an elite defensive recruit. So a lot of people, including myself, just assume that there's just this doubling down on keeping KJ Bolden in state. And he's got family ties to Ohio State. So those are very easy to put together and put out there. But he's throwing out dream school stuff with Florida State, and he continues to set up visits to FSU. And if he locks in that fall official, whether he's committed or not elsewhere on August 5th, that's a very big deal for Florida State. So that could be a late play for the Seminoles. And it's one of those in general, the longer it draws out, the better for the FSUs of the world. And I think the Auburns of the world too.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move to Jalewis Solomon, another prospect that's going to commit right now on August 5th. And his top 5 are Florida State, Auburn, Kentucky, Texas A&M, and South Carolina. Called his visit to Florida State one to remember. Fish, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on Jalewis?
Just watch his film.
He's a really good player.
Yeah, I mean, his film just is unbelievable. I always look at it. Listen, if he does what Kermit Whitfield does and returns a kick in a national championship game, he's earned his scholarship. I think he's that type of kid that he'll make at least one special play that helps your program win a football game at a very high level. I love the kid. I don't know enough about his recruitment as far as where he's looking. I've heard Oklahoma's like one of his top schools. It seems like Florida State kind of got in this one a little late. I'm not going to count them out. I don't think he's going to end up at FSU. That's just my opinion. I think John could probably decide on this kid since he covers Georgia and stuff.
Yeah, and he's a kid that can play again, and I'll let John talk about it, but he's another versatile kid, right, John? He can play both sides of the ball. Yeah,
another two-way guy, but really electric with the ball in his hands, and you understand why his recruitment has, I think, late in the summer, has still bubbled up. We usually see it plateau, but Solomon's a guy that a lot of schools are cycling back on. As you mentioned, Oklahoma, South Carolina, I think is really interesting here. They recruit South Georgia really well, and they've been able to court big-time prospects at the receiver position. And I think He's going to visit there at the end of July. So I think USC is kind of the sneaky program to keep an eye on here. Auburn's doing a good job trying to keep him in the mix, as is Florida State. So I kind of look to those three at this point. But I was talking to Jalewis a little bit last week, and I don't think he's decided. I don't think he's done with the process privately, which always leaves more room for some fluidity. So that one will be fun and a little bit more wide open than we usually get this time of year. So
yeah, and I think Florida State's talked to him about playing both sides of the ball too. I don't think they've got LaWayne McCoy and BJ Gibson, who could both play wide receiver, RDB, and I believe Jalewis fits that mold too. So it's going to be fascinating to see what side of the ball he ends up if he were to end up at Florida State. And as we've seen with as recently as Brian Courtney, they've moved him from tight end to linebacker. So obviously a number of those kids can make the switch after they get to college if they don't end up making the two deep where they start out. Now, we do have a question for you guys, and it's a good one, I think, because this kid has given people reason to question his commitment, and that is going to be LaWayne McCoy, who even after his official visit has stated that his recruitment is wide open, which is what you're telling people is you're not really committed, right? We heard another kid talk about the fact that he was, it might have been LaWayne, I can't remember. Oh, it was TJ Abrams who said, well, I'm 70% committed to Florida State after his visit to Miami or wherever the hell he had been. But anyway, what is y'all's read on where LaWayne McCoy is? And is that a reason why you keep on recruiting Kevin Levy, even if he commits to somebody else tomorrow afternoon?
Well, I'll jump in real quick. Listen, I'm going to stick by what I say. Watch what they do, not what they say. This kid hasn't been on FSU's campus since he committed to Florida State. And
Except for his official visit.
Yeah, but he keeps showing up at Miami, and he's supposed to be at their barbecue or whatever they have at the end of this week. That's always a concern of mine, is when a player visits one school over and over and over, and he's committed to another school and doesn't keep showing up there. And I know Tallahassee's far for a lot of these South Florida kids, so it is a little more convenient, but there are concerns with most people thought he was going to commit to Miami originally. When he committed, it was kind of a surprise to Florida State. While Florida State's had some success at Central, most of those kids usually when Miami wants them, they get them. So it'll be interesting this weekend or the weekend after when Miami has their barbecue or their next
last week of July.
Yeah, when the kids come and visit, if he doesn't pull the trigger for Miami, then I think the recruitment settles back down, and you feel like Florida State has a chance to hold on to him.
Mm-hmm. John?
Yeah, LaWayne is talking about taking multiple visits in the fall. As Fish said, he's not a well-traveled kid. Prior to June, he hadn't been to Miami since he committed to Florida State, I believe back in April. So he hadn't been to many campuses just in general. But I do think right now Miami's got considerable momentum, took those two trips really back-to-back in the month of June. One was a 7-on-7 and one was more voluntary, kind of a classic unofficial visit. And there's no doubt that Miami has responded to that surprising Florida State commitment with a lot of pressure. And a lot of his close friends are starting to come off the board for the Hurricanes. He's one of those kids that was a part of the Miami Gardens Ravens Little League team with Josiah Trader, with Ryan Mack, with OJ Frederick, a bunch of guys who have committed to Miami in this class. So there is a sense that those guys are trying to get the band back together, if that makes sense. And I think he tweeted out last night after Trader committed to Miami, McCoy tweeted out a picture of the Miami Gardens Ravens days. So there's a lot of red flags towards Florida State with McCoy, but he's just so darn good that you got to stay on him. You just got to continue to try to reel him in. But he's talking about multiple schools, not just Miami. So I do think that is an extra layer of optimism for the Florida State angle here, if he continues to consider several schools and not just go so heavy with the true contender, which we all believe to be Miami at this point.
No. All right, well, another kid that kind of doing the same thing, but he's not committed to Florida State or anybody in Florida. He's committed to Ohio State, and there's a lot of back and forth about exactly where Jeremiah Smith is going to end up, another wide receiver prospect from South Florida. I have seen where he's potentially going to be back on Florida State's campus at the end of this month, which if he does, it'll get me out of the ACC Media Day trip because I'll be on campus for that. But what are you guys, listen, I know Miami's still actively recruiting Jeremiah, as just is about everybody, but Fish, I know he's a part of that 7-on-7 team that you and I have talked about from time to time, where guys, Ohio State wants him, they usually get him type of thing. What are your thoughts on both of you on Jeremiah Smith and what's going on with his recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, you saw it last year with Brandon Ennis. Miami tried to get in on him, but like I've said before, when Miami or Ohio State wants a kid off that team, there's ties to that 7-on-7 team and Ohio State that go back a long time, even back to the Florida days with Meyer being at both programs. I just don't see it. I know he's going to visit Florida State. I just feel that Hartline right now is, considered the top recruiter as far as wide receiver coaches. He hasn't really lost a kid he's really wanted. I know Florida State just took a kid from Maryland, but at the end of the day, they already have 2 5-star guys committed, with Jeremiah Smith being one of them. I don't see this thing. I think it's going to be similar to the Ennis thing, where there'll be some interest with Miami, there'll be interest with Florida State, but at the end of the day, unless Hartline decides to take a head coaching job somewhere else or ends up in the NFL and leaves Ohio State, I just don't see this thing going any other way other than him sticking with the Buckeyes.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was doing a coach's hot seat thread on the boards, and I was getting ready to write my deal on Neil Brown and how Brian Hartline's already been mentioned for the West Virginia job should it come open. We haven't even started the 2023 season yet. John, just your thoughts on Jeremiah Smith.
Yeah, I'm right there with Fish. I know some Northwestern fans are campaigning for Brian Hartline with that gig open as well. And I think that's really what it is. Jeremiah has said as much since January. Hey, college football's crazy. I got to do some due diligence. And he's done it. He's been to Miami. He's been to Florida State. He's been to Georgia. He's gone back up to Ohio State. Florida, he's told me last month, was probably the primary contender if something were to shake. But he's also going to watch these seasons, right? He doesn't know a lot about what Florida's going to do and what Miami's going to do at that position. He knows what Ohio State and probably Florida State is going to present at wide receiver. So that's going to factor in too. I think it's mainly Hartline, and hey, if he sticks, I stick. If not, we'll see. But I do think the secondary layer there is what these offenses look like this fall. So if Florida State again continues to kind of be the alpha in the state of Florida, especially from an explosive and offensive standpoint, that's going to matter to the Jeremiah Smiths of the world if something were to shake late in this cycle. But yeah, if everything is status quo at Ohio State, they get back on track. I do believe he ends up there.
Yeah, it's funny that we say back on track. They're in the college football play. Yeah. It is
back on track versus Michigan and Ryan Day.
In fact, it's funny. And I don't think there's going to be a more explosive offense in the country next year than potentially Florida State. And I was talking with a former football coach 2 days ago about what Florida State's prospects are for the 2023 season, and we're both in agreement that they might be able to put 40 or 50 points on just about everybody they play, regardless of who they are, because they have that chance to be so. It's the most talented offense Mike Norvell has had since he's been in Tallahassee, and last year's offense was pretty talented. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how if Florida State lives up to expectation, or even particularly if they exceed expectation. Expectations are pretty big for the Florida State fan base right now. Everybody's penciled in 10 or 11 wins. And, of course, there will be a surprise on that schedule. I'm sure we see it every year that somebody exceeds their own expectations and the media's expectations. But, yeah, certainly I don't know if there will be a more dynamic offense in the ACC or in the Southeast than Florida State, who has a proven quarterback and a ton of skill talent around him. All right, guys, as we get ready to wrap up, my last recruiting question for both of you, and it's going to be open-ended. Is there any names that we have not talked about that you are keeping a particular close tab on as it pertains to Florida State recruiting?
John?
I'll stay in the secondary. I think the play of the politics and how you order your board and execute are going to be fascinating, because there's a couple of in-state DBs that are still on the board for Florida State that are really impressive. Xavier Lucas is a guy who's bumped to 4 stars most recently, long corner out of South Florida. What about Zaquan Patterson? His timeline looks like it's going to be slower rather than faster. So how does FSU make a play there? Kai Bates, same situation in that regard. So there's still a lot of DBs on the board for Florida State. I'm curious to see what maybe the Levy commitment will be the most telling beyond Lester. How they approach that, I think, will be fascinating. I think you could be comfortable grabbing those two and starting to shut it down. But if you don't grab both of them, how open is that door for some of these other in-state DBs that are ranked just as highly or close to some of the bigger names?
Yeah, I really like Kai Bates. I love watching that kid's film. He's got the most. And maybe I've watched too many people backpedal, but the way he can backpedal, the quickness of his feet, and his ability to turn and run are pretty special. Fish, your thoughts on some names we need to watch?
I definitely. I'm gonna just follow up with what John said. It's a deep, kind of solid year for DBs, and Florida State's put themselves in position once again, to land these guys. And once Lester commits, it just really opens up the opportunity to just cherry pick who they really want. We talked, even Jabari Howard, who was committed to Michigan State, Florida State. I know Coach Randy Shannon likes him. He likes bigger, longer, athletic corners. I think Howard's more of a safety at the next level, but he has the ability to play corners, a scheme that you got to protect him a little bit because he's not a guy that's going to chase guys in motion, double moves, guys that have some quickness will give him problems. I've seen that at camps, that he's not as fluid as some of the other guys, but they have so many choices right now. I think Levy's far down their board more than people think. I think that's why you see the kid committing to Louisville. If they really wanted him, he would be in their class. I think Ricky Knight took his spot. Once Knight committed, that was it. And Florida State said, all right, that's going to be our floor. And he's a really good floor. Let's go after the Whales. The Whales are still there. Once you get Lester, all of a sudden, if they get a Zaquan Patterson or they get one of these other guys, all of a sudden they've hit a home run at that position. And they've put themselves in that position where they can focus on those one or two guys. They don't have to recruit 6 guys now. They're down to the one or two guys they really want. And if they land one, they hit a home run. They land 2, then you're talking one of the best defensive back classes in the country. So I like what they've done. I've always been of roster management and recruit at a position of strength. Take guys that can play for you early on, but you can, if you have a good season, you can recruit above them. And you know what? Those kids will find other schools if Florida State continues to bring in these top-notch kids.
All right. Well, listen, as Fish and John, I know you are too, we're all huge college football fans. So we're going to switch away from recruiting real quick as we finish up. And obviously a huge day again for Florida State, 24 hours with the commitments of both Jonathan Daniels and Tye Hylton on the offensive line. And, of course, you got we're expecting at least one more commitment to go Florida State's way tomorrow in Micaiah Danzy. But guys, one of the things that has shocked the college football world this week has been the situation at Northwestern. Obviously, last Friday they suspended Pat Fitzgerald for what was going to be 2 weeks without pay. The president and evidently the board of trustees reversed course over the weekend, and on Sunday night, Monday morning, he was let go by Northwestern. My first question is, none of us know the details. That they have not released the report. Certainly sounds like it's not a good situation, but how surprised were you when you heard that news? And then, of course, these, I guess, people that consider themselves legitimate sports writers and college football writers, the first 2 names I've heard to take over a culture situation or Ed Orgeron and Urban Meyer. So I don't know how people put this shit on the computer and consider it to be legit, because obviously you're not going to go hire Ed Orgeron or Urban Meyer to replace Pat Fitzgerald. But how shocked were you by the situation, and how and Fish, I know this could have ramifications in the transfer portal, because I believe these guys are allowed to enter the portal now that there's been a coaching change. And you and I specifically have talked about a couple of linebackers on their roster. And but just get your thoughts on the Northwestern situation, and Fish, more specifically to you, should Florida State look at those linebackers?
I definitely think they should look at those 2 linebackers when you have guys that are, getting double-digit tackles, and you have a struggle to get guys to get single tackles. Those guys can be important to your program. I'm shocked. One, I've met Pat Fitzgerald I know what type of program he's run. I believe this is one of those. I don't know enough about the whole hazing thing. You go 1-11, and the year before you went 1-11, you had to fire longtime coaches. I knew Marty Long that was let go the year before. I think this is more. It's guys inside of that program. He probably didn't want to fire anybody this year, and guys got upset, and somebody inside that program didn't want him the head coach anymore, and they find a way to get rid of you. They were never going to fire him off of record or performance because he had done too much. He's the first coach to have a winning record. I think he has he's plus 10 or 15 in the win column at Northwestern, which honestly is one of the hardest schools to win at. I mean, before he got there and the two prior coaches back in the 80s, people that didn't follow Northwestern, they were a joke of college football. I mean, I think they didn't win a Big Ten game for 7 or 8 years in a row. Somebody, I believe, wanted him gone. They found one or two kids that could put together some sort of story about hazing, which I just think it's kind of fishy, and it's sad because he was a great coach. Here's a guy that could have easily been the Bears head coach. I know that programs inside the Big Ten went after him. I think he was on USC's board at one time. He turned all those programs down over and over and over to stay at Northwestern, stay loyal to that program. And I have a hard time believing now he's getting fired for something that it seems outlandish to me. So,
John?
Yeah, I feel similarly to Fish. Definitely wasn't expecting this, especially after seeing the suspension. Usually that's kind of the end of the process. So for it to have opened back up so quickly after that decision came down, you knew it was going to go downhill pretty quickly. So you understand in this climate, especially how it could move so quickly with the court of public opinion. Unfortunately for many, social media, all of that is going to go in one direction. So you almost understand feeling like your hands are tied as an administration. So yeah, I was surprised, just like many folks were, especially relative to not hearing anything negative for so long. He'd been there a million years, it feels like, obviously played there, and as Fish said, turned down a lot of great gigs to stay there. So you hadn't heard anything negative in that entire span. And then all at once, it bubbles up to a firing. So yeah, I'm pretty surprised. But look, yeah, that's this day and age of college football. Everything has to be more buttoned up than it ever has been. And now it's wide open. Who takes that gig? How do you even try to right that ship? Regardless of that perception, how do you right that ship? As Fish said, it's a ridiculously hard gig academically. You're in the middle of the Big Ten in Chicago, where everybody in that conference recruits. So it's not easy, certainly. So that'll be fascinating. But yeah, those players now, they've got a 30-day window to jump in the portal. So I believe many of them will, because I guarantee you, a couple kids I know who've gone to Northwestern over the last few years, they went because of Pat. Right. That was the selling point. It was Pat. So the portal, I would assume, is going to be pretty active, because when they did go outside of that footprint, it was Fitzgerald that led those guys there.
Yeah, they were getting ready to. And listen, I don't think most people know there's a lot of money at Northwestern. A lot of money. They were getting ready, or they were about to start on an $800 million improvement plan on that stadium. So wow. In fact, it's funny. And the guys no longer with Rivals, and I can't remember who I talked to, but it was early on when Osceola joined Rivals. I said, "Who is one team that could surprise you in the NIL, and because of the NIL game?" And his answer was Northwestern. So, but yeah, listen, I'd never heard a bad word about Pat Fitzgerald. I got a friend of mine who coached with him, and he spoke very highly of him. So I was as shocked as anybody else. But man, it's been anything other than slow in July for college football, and obviously this weekend is just going to keep on trucking. And again, there will be an opportunity for Florida State and other colleges to have some kids on campus the last full week of July. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But Fish and John, man, I know you guys are busy. I want to thank you guys for taking some time out of your day to talk to us a little bit about the commitments of Jonathan Daniels and Tye Hylton, and then obviously moving forward and some of the names for Florida State fans to look forward to. Look look out for over the coming weeks and months is December 15th or whatever the early national signing date is. We'll be here before we know it, because this I don't think there's ever been a quicker offseason that I can remember in college football. There's been absolutely no dead time. Recruiting is always been considered a 365-day-a-year job, but it certainly seems to be more so than ever. But guys, I hope you guys have a great weekend. We'll be back with Seminole Sidelines on Monday, probably to talk about the commitment of Micaiah Danzy to Florida State. But I hope everyone that was listening and watching has a great weekend. If you're not an Osceola subscriber and just listen to our Seminole Sidelines podcast or videocast, please go to theosceola.com or floridastate.rivals.com. Check us out. Fish has got all kind of information up on the premium message board, which you do have to be a subscriber to. John will post threads usually on a weekly basis on our premium message board. And, of course, we also have articles from John, myself, and Fish on recruiting, as well as Kurt Weiler's got some information on FSU's NIL collective, joining an association with 6 other schools. I'm not so much caught up on that yet and what all that means. I will be reading that article myself later. But we do appreciate it, guys. Y'all have a great weekend. And if you're going to join us on Monday, we'll be back at 12:30 on Monday. We went at 12 noon today because we wanted to be live after Tye Hylton announced his commitment to Florida State, and a big weekend for the Seminoles. Start of a big weekend for the Seminoles, and really a big month for Florida State, who has now moved up to the 13th ranked recruiting class for 2024 based off Rivals.com's ranking. So, guys, have a great weekend. And for Florida State fans and Osceola subscribers, we will see you on Monday at 12:30. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers.